For 35-year-old Sophie Parker, life had settled into a rhythm she thought would carry her forward for decades. 12 years of marriage to John Parker had built a life that felt predictable, if not thrilling. A comfortable condo outside Philadelphia, John's steady income from his corporate job, and the routine of dinners together at the kitchen island, weekend errands, and holiday visits with his colleagues. It wasn't the fairy tale she once dreamed of, but it was steady, and steady had always seemed safe. That's why the moment arrived like thunder, loud, startling, impossible to ignore. John came home early one Tuesday evening, loosened his tie, and sat across from her with the air of a man about to deliver a carefully rehearsed speech. He didn't hesitate. "Sophie, this isn't working anymore. We need to file for divorce." The words landed so simply, like paperwork being shuffled across a desk. Sophie blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Divorce," he repeated, steady, professional. "We've grown apart. I feel like I'm suffocating. You're on autopilot all the time. Just cooking, cleaning, chatting with the neighbors. You're 35, soft, not 70. I don't see growth. I don't see excitement. I need more." Sophie's throat tightened. "John, do you even hear yourself? You're the one who asked me to quit my job. You said your wife shouldn't have to stress, that you wanted a calm, perfect home to come back to. You wanted me to be here, to hold the house together. You made it sound like a gift." His jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "I didn't force you, Sophie. We agreed. It was the right decision at the time." "We didn't agree," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "We fought about it. You wore me down. You didn't like my friends, said they were a distraction, so I cut them off. You didn't want me working long hours, so I left a job I loved. You told me we'd be fine because you made enough money. And now you sit here and say I'm the problem." John exhaled through his nose, the way he did when he was done debating. "It's not about blame. It's about reality. I need to evolve, and I can't do that with you. I've been thinking about this for a long time. It's not sudden." Sophie's chest ached, but something deeper, intuition, instinct, pressed forward. She steadied herself. "Is there someone else?" John looked away. His silence was louder than anything. His ears flushed pink, his mouth tightened. That was all the answer she needed. "There isn't there," she whispered. Finally he muttered, "Yes. Ife e machimwan." The words hollowed her out. Sophie stared at him, this man she had built her life around, who now spoke as casually as if he were announcing a business transfer. "After everything, you throw me away for what?" "Some woman who makes you feel young again." He bristled. "Don't diminish this. She's not a fling. She's someone I connect with in ways we never did. She sees me. She makes me feel alive." Sophie swallowed back the sting of tears. "So 12 years mean nothing?" "Of course they mean something," John said, but his tone was too even, too detached. "But we have no kids. The condo is mine from before the marriage. So legally it's separate property. There isn't much to fight over. Pennsylvania is a no-fault state. We can make this clean, simple. No courtroom battles. You'll get support to land on your feet." Her hands trembled against the cool granite countertop. "Support," she repeated, almost laughing. "You think tossing me an envelope of cash makes this right?" "I'm trying to make it easier," he said, leaning forward, as if logic could erase cruelty. "You need a fresh start. You have that old family house in the Poconos, your inheritance from your grandparents. It's yours, free and clear. Go there. Fix it up. Think about what's next. You'll have time to breathe." Sophie's mind flashed to the farmhouse she hadn't stepped foot in for years. Clapboard siding weathered gray, porch railings rotted through. The smell of hay and dust she used to run from as a girl. She had left it behind for a reason. That house was the past, lonely, rural, suffocating. "You're sending me away like I'm some burden you can't wait to drop," she said, her voice low but steady. I'm offering you stability, John countered, his tone softening as if he believed himself magnanimous. 1 week. Take what you need. I'll wire money to get you started. Please don't drag this out. We both know it's over. He stood then, straightened his tie, and walked toward the door with the efficiency of a man heading to his next meeting. The door clicked shut, leaving Sophie in silence. She sat at the kitchen island, staring at the untouched dinner she'd made earlier, the smell of roasted chicken now nauseating. On the bookshelf, their wedding photo, sunlit, smiling, naive, stared back at her. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the frame face down. For the first time in 12 years, the condo felt foreign, like a hotel room after checkout. Her marriage had ended not with a storm of rage, but with a calculated conversation and a proposal to disappear into the hills. And as the night pressed in around her, Sophie realized she would have to go back to that old farmhouse in the Pocono Hills. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Sophie moved through the condo like a guest at the end of a long stay, folding clothes into boxes, stacking plates with mechanical precision. The envelope John had left, crisp bills banded together, sat in her purse like both an insult and a lifeline. She hated the thought of spending his money, but she also knew she had little choice. There was no job waiting for her, no apartment in her name. What she had was the farmhouse in the Pocono Hills, a property she hadn't touched in over a decade. By Saturday, her small SUV was packed to the roofline, the back window nearly blocked by boxes labeled with her neat handwriting. She paused at the door of the condo, glancing once more at the empty rooms, the place where her marriage had quietly expired. She didn't cry. The tears had already dried into something sharper. She pulled the door shut and carried herself down to the car without looking back. The drive north stretched long and silent, the hum of the highway filling the void John used to occupy with casual complaints about traffic or updates from the office. Philadelphia gave way to suburbs, then to open stretches of farmland dotted with red barns and faded billboards. As the miles passed, cell service flickered and then vanished, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts. The closer she came to the mountains, the heavier her chest felt. The sun dipped low by the time she reached the exit marked for the Poconos. The road narrowed, winding into hills that smelled faintly of pine and earth, the evening air cooler than in the city. She remembered childhood trips along this same stretch of road, her face pressed to the window while her parents argued softly in the front seat. Even then, she had promised herself she would leave this place and never return. Now, irony guided her back like a tether. When she finally turned down the gravel drive, her headlights caught the farmhouse. It stood hunched against the trees, a silhouette of neglect. The siding, once white, was gray and peeling. Windows were covered by warped wooden boards. The porch sagged, its railing splintered. The yard was a jungle of weeds and waist-high grass, a tangle of wild growth reclaiming what her grandparents had once tamed. Sophie cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the house. The silence pressed in. No neighbors, no hum of traffic, just the sound of crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog somewhere deeper in the hills. She stepped out, gravel crunching beneath her boots, and pulled her suitcase from the trunk. The air was sharp, earthy, filled with the scent of damp leaves and moss. She walked up the creaking porch steps and slipped the old brass key into the lock. For a moment, she wasn't sure it would turn. Then it clicked, and the door gave way with a long groan, exhaling the smell of dust and stale air. Inside, the house felt frozen in time, yet abandoned. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of her flashlight. A moth fluttered against the wall, disturbed from its hiding place. The kitchen table was still there, draped in a thin film of grime. Cabinets hung crooked, and in one corner, a spider web stretched like lace across a broken chair. The air was damp, tinged with mold and something sour. She set her bag down and leaned against the wall, the weight of the place pressing down on her. Memories rose unbidden. Her grandmother bent over the stove, the smell of cornbread in the oven, her mother pulling weeds with hands red from the soil. Sophie herself, younger, running barefoot through the yard only to trip and scrape her knee on the gravel. She had hated it, the endless chores, the isolation, the way the field stretched like a prison. She had sworn to escape, and she had. Until now, the house groaned in the wind, reminding her that this was no sentimental visit. This was where she had to live, at least for now. She wandered through the rooms, opening doors cautiously. The living room held a sagging couch, its cushions gnawed by mice. The bedroom upstairs was worse. Cobwebs thick in the corners, floorboards warped from years of damp. Still, she dragged her suitcase up the narrow stairs and unzipped it, laying out sheets on the least stained mattress she could find. As night fell, the farmhouse seemed to shrink around her. The walls whispered with the scurry of small animals. The roof ticked as it cooled. Sophie lay in bed, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened. Every creak made her flinch. She missed the city's background noise, the distant sirens, the hum of cars. Out here, the silence was too complete, broken only by the lonely sound of an owl calling through the trees. For the first time since John's announcement, Sophie allowed herself to admit the truth. She was afraid, not just of the house or of being alone, but of the blank future waiting to be written. 12 years of marriage had ended with a conversation over dinner. Now she lay in a bed that smelled of mildew, staring at a ceiling she once thought she'd never see again. She pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her breath. The farmhouse was hers. It might be crumbling, but it was all she had left. And somehow, she would have to make it into a beginning instead of an ending. Morning light leaked through the cracks in the boarded windows, thin and pale, cutting across the dust that hung heavy in the air. Sophie lay awake on the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had come in fits, each creak of the old farmhouse pulling her back into alertness. By dawn, her body ached, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days. Reality was no longer something she could postpone. She had no job, no savings of her own, no friends in the city willing or able to cushion her fall. 12 years as a housewife had left her with a blank resume and a tenure hole she could never explain away in an interview. Who would hire her now? A grocery store cashier? A gas station clerk? She could already picture the pitying stares of managers half her age. The thought of selling the farmhouse drifted across her mind like a desperate solution. If she could unload it, even for a fraction of its value, maybe she could scrape together enough for a tiny apartment back near Philadelphia, pick up part-time work, and slowly rebuild. But she knew the truth before the fantasy even finished forming. No one was lining up to buy a rotting house tucked into the Poconos. The boards on the windows were warning signs as clear as any. Realtors would laugh. Buyers wanted mountain cabins with decks and lake views, not a decaying family relic overrun with weeds. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her knees. That meant the farmhouse was not an escape hatch. It was her only lifeline. And if she was going to survive, she had to make it livable, maybe even profitable. Ideas flickered, timid but insistent. She had always loved flowers, even as a girl, arranging wild daisies in jars when her grandmother's garden bloomed, sneaking into the yard after school to braid stems together. Could she take a class, maybe in floral design? Open a shop someday? The thought felt ridiculous, like a dream out of reach, but it stirred something warm. Or maybe she could work the land. Everyone in these hills seemed to have a side hustle, selling homemade jam at farmers' markets, keeping a few goats for milk, raising chickens for eggs. A homestead. She tried to picture herself hauling buckets of feed, trimming raspberry bushes, kneading dough for bread to sell at the Saturday market in town. The image was foreign, but also strangely grounding. Sophie stood, brushed the dust from her jeans, and walked to the front of the house. The boards nailed over the windows stared back at her, as though sealing her away from the outside world. Her fingers traced the splintered wood. This was what John had meant when he said she was stuck. He'd boxed her in, and she'd let him. But she didn't have to keep living that way. She found the toolbox her grandfather had left behind, rusted but intact, tucked in the corner of the shed. Inside was a crowbar, still sturdy. She gripped it with both hands, braced herself, and wedged the metal tip beneath the first board. It resisted at first, creaking, but then gave with a sharp crack. Dust rained down, stinging her eyes, but light poured through the gap. Her chest rose with something fierce, almost defiant. She pried off another board, and another, until the window stood open, sunlight spilling into the room. The farmhouse smelled of mold and age, but the light transformed it, turning shadows into possibilities. She moved to the next window, muscles burning, sweat trickling down her back. With each board she tore away, the house seemed to breathe again, and so did she. By the time she stopped, exhausted and covered in grime, the rooms glowed with natural light for the first time in years. Sophie stood in the middle of the kitchen, hair damp against her temples, hands raw from the crowbar, and looked around. It was still a ruin. Dust piled in corners, wallpaper peeling in strips, mice droppings scattered along the floorboards. But it was no longer a tomb. It was a beginning. She filled a bucket from the pump in the yard, hauled it back inside, and began scrubbing the counters. The water turned black almost instantly, but she dumped it and filled another. The rhythm steadied her. Each swipe of the rag clearing more than just dirt. By evening, the kitchen bore the faintest resemblance to a place someone might live. When she finally collapsed into the rickety chair by the window, Sophie caught sight of the hills rolling beyond the property line. The setting sun painted them gold, and for the first time since John had uttered the word divorce, she felt a thread of control winding its way back into her hands. She whispered to herself, barely audible over the cicadas, "If I can open a window, I can open a door." The farmhouse creaked in agreement, as though it, too, had been waiting for someone to believe it could live again. The next morning, Sophie pulled on work gloves that were already fraying at the seams. A broom leaned against the wall, and beside it, a stack of boards she'd ripped from the windows the day before. Sunlight streamed freely now, cutting across the kitchen and catching the dust in golden rays. For the first time, the farmhouse felt less like a mausoleum and more like a place that could breathe. She carried another armful of debris toward the porch, the boards scraping her forearms. That's when she heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive. Sophie froze, heart hammering. John had promised not to drag this out, but some part of her still feared he might show up, smug and patronizing, to check on his abandoned wife. "Hey!" a man's voice called sharply. "What are you doing there?" Sophie spun around, boards clattering to the porch floor. A tall man stood at the edge of the yard, framed by the overgrown weeds. He wore a red and blue plaid shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows and jeans scuffed with dirt. A broad-shouldered figure with a stern face shadowed by the morning sun. At his side trotted a sandy-colored dog with a curled tail, ears pricked forward in alert curiosity. Sophie's pulse quickened. "Excuse me." The man took a few steps closer, his voice edged with suspicion. "This house has been empty for years. You can't just break in." Her indignation rose. She yanked off a glove and straightened. "I didn't break in. This is my house." His brow furrowed. "Your house?" "Yes. I'm Sophie Parker. My grandparents own this place. She exhaled, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I moved back in yesterday." The man studied her for a long moment. Then his expression softened, suspicion giving way to something like recognition. "Parker," he repeated. "You're Margaret Parker's granddaughter?" Sophie nodded cautiously. The man let out a breath and chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought this place would never see life again." He stepped forward and extended a hand. "Name's Daniel Whitmore. I live about a mile down the road. Built my house after the divorce." Sophie hesitated, then shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who worked with tools more than keyboards. The dog wagged its tail and padded up the porch steps, sniffing Sophie's shoes before sitting squarely at her feet as though deciding she belonged. "And this," Daniel said, nodding toward the dog, "is Russell. He usually doesn't take to strangers, but looks like you've passed his test." Sophie crouched, scratching gently behind the dog's ears. Russell leaned into her touch with a satisfied huff. A surprising warmth spread through her chest. "He's beautiful," she murmured. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, watching her with a small smile. "So, you're moving back in here. Brave choice." "Not much of a choice," Sophie admitted, standing again. "It's all I've got left." His gaze flicked over the sagging porch, the boarded windows she hadn't reached yet, the jungle of weeds choking the yard. "Well, you've got your work cut out for you. But it's not impossible. I know. Did the same thing myself a few years back." "You rebuilt your house?" "Built it from scratch," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "After my ex left, I needed something that was mine. So I bought land, laid the foundation, and got my hands dirty. Figured if my life was starting over, my house should too." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a plain-spoken honesty that caught Sophie off guard. He nodded toward the pile of boards at her feet. "Need a hand? You'll break your back doing this alone." Sophie opened her mouth to protest, instinct telling her not to lean on anyone, not again. But the sincerity in his eyes made the refusal catch in her throat. "I wouldn't say no to advice," she admitted. Daniel grinned, pushing off the railing. "Advice comes free. Labor costs a cup of coffee." Sophie laughed softly, the sound surprising her. It had been days since she'd laughed, maybe weeks. "Deal." He walked the perimeter with her, pointing out weak spots on the roofline, where to patch leaks, which boards were salvageable. His voice was steady, practical, and carried the ease of someone who didn't mind hard work. Russell padded faithfully beside them, occasionally darting into the weeds, only to circle back, tail wagging. As they stood by the back porch, Daniel glanced at Sophie, his expression thoughtful. "You know, your grandmother was one of the kindest women in these hills. Helped folks whether she had the time or not. If you've got even half her grit, this place will stand tall again." Sophie felt the sting of tears at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them back. She wasn't ready to cry in front of a stranger. Still, something about his words struck deep, as though he'd given her permission to believe the impossible. Daniel clapped his hands together. "All right, tomorrow I'll swing by with a ladder and some tools. We'll get these windows cleared properly and see if that pump still works like it should." "You don't have to," she began. "Sure I do," he interrupted, tone light but firm. "Neighbors look out for each other out here. Besides, Russell's already adopted you. I don't argue with him." At that, the dog barked once, as if in agreement. Sophie smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like forever. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face this battle entirely alone. The following week unfolded in rhythms Sophie had almost forgotten her body could hold. Mornings began with the sound of gravel crunching under Daniel's pickup as he pulled into the drive, ladder tied to the roof and Russell bounding out before the engine had even stilled. The dog would run to the porch, tail curled high, greeting Sophie as though she were a long-lost friend. And in a way, she was lost and slowly being found again. Together, Sophie and Daniel tore away the remaining boards that had sealed the house like a tomb. With each plank that clattered to the ground, more sunlight streamed inside, warming the rooms that had sat dark for too long. Daniel showed her how to pry nails without splitting the wood, how to brace her foot for leverage. His instructions were patient, his laughter easy when she cursed under her breath at stubborn beams. When the windows finally opened wide, Sophie stood back, hair sticking to her temples with sweat, and marveled at the view she hadn't seen in years. Rolling hills draped in summer green, pines crowding the horizon, the sky so wide it seemed to swallow her whole. For the first time since John's words had shattered her world, Sophie felt her lungs expand with something more than grief. She felt possibility. The work carried them into other tasks. Daniel tested the wiring, flicking breakers until a faint hum of electricity returned. "Needs updating," he said, "but it'll get you through." They dragged buckets of water from the pump, and when it sputtered to life with a rusty groan, Sophie laughed, an unguarded, uncalculated sound that startled her as much as it delighted Daniel. The roof became their next battle. Sophie steadied the ladder while Daniel climbed, hammer in one hand, shingles tucked under his arm. Russell lay sprawled in the grass below, tongue lolling, keeping vigil as if supervising the project. Sophie looked up at Daniel silhouetted against the sky, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, and wondered how long it had been since she'd seen someone pour so much of themselves into something without complaint. In the evenings, when the tools were put away and the sun sank low, Daniel would sit with her on the porch steps, a thermos of coffee between them. It was during those quiet hours that his story began to unfold. "My ex-wife left when our daughter was 10, he said one night, voice even, as if he'd rehearsed it so many times it no longer cut sharp. She said she needed freedom, a chance to live the life she'd missed. I fought to keep our girl and I won. Raised her myself. She's 20 now in nursing school downstate." Sophie turned toward him, surprise flickering across her face. "You raised her alone?" He nodded, sipping from the thermos. "It wasn't easy, but you figure things out when you have to. I built the house I live in now with my own hands. Thought if I could give her stability, maybe she wouldn't feel abandoned the way I did when her mom left." The honesty in his voice was steady without self-pity. Sophie admired it, though it stirred an ache in her chest. "And now? Do you ever hear from your ex?" Daniel shrugged. "Once in a while. Birthdays, maybe a holiday card. But she's living her life somewhere else. And we're doing fine without her." He looked at Sophie then, not with pity but with recognition. Being left behind doesn't mean you're finished. Sometimes it just means you've been set free. The words hung between them, more comforting than any platitude she'd heard since John's betrayal. Sophie hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them until they landed in her bones like truth. The days blurred into a rhythm of labor and companionship. Sophie scrubbed walls until her arms ached, patched curtains from old fabric, and swept floors that had forgotten what clean felt like. Russell followed her from room to room, sprawling at her feet when she finally collapsed into a chair, his quiet presence a balm against the loneliness that had haunted her since leaving the city. And in those long hours of work, Sophie discovered something she hadn't expected: joy. Not the fleeting, artificial kind she once chased through mall shopping trips or dinner reservations, but the quiet, sustaining joy of building something with her own hands. Each layer of dust she swept away, each board she sanded, felt like a reclamation of herself. One evening, as fireflies lit the yard and the cicadas sang their endless chorus, Sophie looked at Daniel across the porch. He was tired, hair damp with sweat, but his eyes were bright with something steady, something safe. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for not treating me like I'm broken." Daniel tilted his head, his smile gentle. "You're not broken, Sophie. You're just getting started again. Big difference." Russell barked once, as if to underline the point, then rested his head on Sophie's knee. She scratched his ears, heart swelling. For the first time in a long while, she no longer felt like she was only surviving. She was beginning to live again. It was late on a Thursday when Sophie and Daniel finally called it a day. They had spent hours clearing brush from the side yard, pulling out roots that had knotted deep into the soil, and hauling broken furniture from the upstairs rooms to the porch. The farmhouse looked less like an abandoned ruin and more like a place preparing to be lived in. They sat on the steps, the twilight stretching across the hills, painting the horizon in lavender and rose. Russell lay sprawled at Sophie's feet, belly rising and falling in the rhythm of a dog exhausted by loyalty. Sophie took the thermos of coffee Daniel handed her, the metal warm against her palms, and stared at the line of trees swaying in the evening wind. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the kind that carried comfort rather than awkwardness. Finally, Sophie drew in a breath, her voice unsteady. "Do you ever wonder if it was all for nothing?" Daniel glanced at her, brow creasing. "What do you mean?" "My marriage," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. 12 years, and at the end of it, John sat me down and told me I was boring, that I'd stopped being attractive, that I wasn't growing. He said I lived like a robot. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "And the worst part is he made me into that person. He pushed me to quit my job, to give up my friends, to build my whole world around him. Then he turned around and blamed me for being exactly what he asked for." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "He admitted there's another woman, some perfect connection, some spark I couldn't give him. He spoke about her like he'd found the answer to his life. And I was just a mistake he'd outgrown." Daniel didn't interrupt. He let the words spill out, let them hang in the dusk air until Sophie felt emptied. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "I know what that feels like." She turned, surprised. "My ex-wife said the same things," Daniel continued, "that she needed freedom, that I was holding her back. Truth was, she'd already found someone else. By the time she walked out, it wasn't even about us anymore. It was about her running toward whatever, or whoever, she thought would save her." He took a sip of coffee, eyes far away. It felt like being shoved off a moving train. One day you think you're heading somewhere together, the next you're just standing alone on the tracks, wondering what you did wrong. Sophie's chest ached at the image. "How did you survive it?" "I didn't, not at first," Daniel admitted. "I was angry, bitter. I drowned myself in work and tried to pretend I didn't care. But raising my daughter forced me to show up, day after day. Somewhere along the line, I realized being left wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else." His gaze shifted to her, steady and kind. "Divorce isn't a death sentence, Sophie. It's not the end of your story. It's just a brutal way of turning the page." Her eyes burned, though she refused to let tears fall. "It doesn't feel like a new page. It feels like a blank one I don't know how to write on." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the hard part. But blank pages are also freedom. You get to choose what comes next, and you don't have to let someone else hold the pen anymore." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt charged, alive with understanding. Sophie felt something loosen in her chest, as though the weight she'd been dragging since that night in the condo had finally shifted. For the first time, she believed she wasn't just broken, she was unfinished. Russell stirred, lifting his head to nuzzle Sophie's hand. She scratched behind his ears, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You make it sound almost simple." "It's not simple," Daniel said, smiling back, "but it is possible." The last of the daylight slipped behind the hills. Daniel stood, stretching his back, then offered his hand to Sophie. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his, letting him pull her to her feet. "Where are we going?" "To the river," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something softer, almost nostalgic. "I grew up here. That river was my escape when things got bad at home. After the divorce, I bought the land along its banks, built my house near it. I think you should see it. Remind yourself the world isn't just made of endings." Sophie glanced once at the dark outline of the farmhouse behind her, then at the expanse of hills ahead. For the first time, she felt a flicker of curiosity, even hope. She nodded. "All right, show me." And with Russell trotting faithfully at their side, she followed Daniel down the path that led toward the sound of rushing water, toward a place that would begin to reshape her life. The path to the river wound through tall grass and maples that whispered with the night breeze. Fireflies hovered like tiny lanterns, Winking in and out of sight, Russell bounded ahead, splashing into the shallows before circling back with a joyful bark. Sophie followed Daniel down the slope, the ground soft with moss and roots. When the trees opened, she drew in a breath. The river stretched wide under the moonlight, its surface glimmering silver. The sound of rushing water was steady, soothing, like a heartbeat older than the hills themselves. "This was my refuge growing up," Daniel said, his voice gentler now. "When my parents fought, when school felt too small, I came here. After my divorce, I bought the land to make sure it always stayed mine. It's the one place that's never let me down." Sophie knelt by the bank, letting the cool water slip through her fingers. It carried the scent of pine and stone, washing something heavy from her shoulders. "It feels untouched," she whispered. Daniel laughed softly. "That's because it is. No condos, no traffic, no deadlines. Just this." He kicked off his boots, rolled up his jeans, and waded in until the water lapped at his calves. He turned, grinning. "Come on, Parker. You need this." Sophie hesitated, but his smile coaxed her forward. She slipped off her shoes, rolled her pants, and stepped into the river. The cold hit her ankles like a shock, but then a rush of exhilaration swept through her. She laughed, a sound so pure it startled her. Daniel's grin widened. They waded deeper, the water rising to their knees, then their waists. The current tugged playfully at Sophie's clothes, urging her to let go. She tilted her head back, watching the stars appear one by one, listening to the cicadas sing from the trees. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt unburdened. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying across the water. Sophie nodded, hair damp against her cheeks. "It feels like I can breathe again." Russell barked from the shore, as if cheering them on. Daniel laughed, then swam a few strokes into the deeper part, water cascading down his face when he surfaced. Sophie followed hesitantly, then burst out laughing when the current lifted her feet. She floated on her back, staring up at the vast expanse of stars. Time slipped away, measured only by the river's song. When she finally drifted close to Daniel again, their laughter softened into something quieter, almost reverent. He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. The touch lingered, warm even against the chill of the river. Sophie met his gaze, and in it she saw not pity or judgment, but recognition, a mirror of her own longing to be seen, to be chosen. He leaned in, slowly, as if giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was neither rushed nor hesitant, but full and certain. It was not the kiss of strangers testing boundaries. It was the kiss of two people who had already built trust through labor, silence, and shared pain. Sophie felt her heart pound, not with fear, but with awakening. She had thought that part of her was dead, buried under years of neglect and betrayal. But here, under the stars, in the arms of a man who had also been broken and rebuilt, she felt alive again. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "You deserve better than what you've been given," he whispered. Her throat tightened, but she smiled. "So do you." They waded back to shore, water dripping from their clothes, hair plastered to their faces. They collapsed onto the grass, laughing breathlessly, Russell circling them with delighted barks before settling at their side. The laughter faded into quiet. Daniel's hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally, like they had always belonged there. He stared out at the river, then back at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sophie," he said slowly, "I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know what this is. You've been through hell, and I know it's fast. But I also know what I feel when I'm around you. I want you to move in with me. Not someday now. I don't want to wait." The words landed heavy and tender all at once. Sophie blinked, her chest tightening. "Daniel, we've only known each other a month." He nodded. "I know, but sometimes you don't need more time. Sometimes you just know. And I know." Her instinct was to retreat, to protect herself from more disappointment. But as she looked at him, at the man who had shown up every morning with tools and patience, who had listened to her pain without judgment, who had opened his world to her without hesitation, she felt the walls inside her bend. She bit her lip, heart racing. "It's crazy." "Maybe," Daniel said, his smile soft, almost shy. "But maybe crazy is exactly what we need." Sophie stared at the river, at the stars mirrored on its surface. She had been abandoned, dismissed, told she was nothing more than a burden. And yet here she was wanted, not for what she could give, but for who she was. Her heart answered before her head could argue. She squeezed his hand gently. She wasn't ready to say yes aloud, not yet, but she didn't pull away either. And that was enough for now. Daniel seemed to understand. He leaned back on the grass, content, and together they watched the river carry the night forward. A year slipped by, though for Sophie it felt less like time passing and more like time returning. The woman who had once sat hollow-eyed in a crumbling farmhouse was gone. In her place stood someone younger in spirit, with light in her eyes and purpose in her hands. With Daniel's steady encouragement, Sophie had enrolled in classes at a floral design studio in Strasbourg. She discovered she had a natural gift for color, balance, and breathing life into arrangements. Soon she was supplying bouquets to local shops and wedding venues. Her name whispered with admiration. Customers didn't see a divorcee rebuilding her life. They saw a professional whose work carried warmth and elegance. Her wardrobe changed too, no longer the resigned jeans and faded sweaters of a forgotten wife, but dresses that highlighted her confidence, pieces chosen not for John's approval, but for her own reflection in the mirror. She moved with ease now, with Russell bounding happily at her side and Daniel never far from reach. So when the embossed invitation arrived, John Parker's 40th birthday celebration, Sophie almost laughed. She had no reason to go, and yet something inside her insisted she must. Not out of spite, but out of closure. To show him, and herself, how far she'd come. On the evening of the party, Daniel's truck pulled up outside the event hall in Allentown, headlights cutting across the manicured parking lot. Sophie stepped down in a gown of deep emerald silk, her hair swept into loose waves that caught the light. A delicate pendant rested at her collarbone. She looked radiant, like a woman at the height of her power, not someone dragging the chains of the past. Daniel offered his arm, his suit crisp, his presence solid and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Sophie smiled, slipping her hand into his. More than ever. Inside, the hall glittered with balloons and chandeliers. Laughter echoed from groups of John's colleagues and acquaintances. Sophie recognized the type. Men in tailored suits bragging about investments, women in polished heels exchanging smiles sharp as glass. And then John appeared, standing near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. His hair had thinned, his tie hung slightly loose, and his smile seemed plastered rather than genuine. He looked older than 40, tired in a way success couldn't conceal. He turned, expecting another guest, but froze when his eyes landed on Sophie. For a moment, he didn't even recognize her. The emerald gown shimmered under the lights, her skin glowed, and her laughter with Daniel was unforced, bright. John's mouth parted as if to speak, but no words came. Sophie caught his stare and walked toward him, each step measured, graceful. Daniel's hand rested gently at the small of her back, steady as ever. "John!" Sophie greeted, her voice warm but distant, like one might address an old neighbor. "Happy birthday." He blinked, trying to gather himself. "Sophie? You look." He stopped, unable to finish. "Thank you," she said simply, sparing him the effort. Her smile was polite, not sharp, not vindictive, simply unshakable. The people around John turned, whispering, curious about the woman who commanded the room without trying. John fumbled for composure, adjusting his tie. "I didn't expect. I mean, it's been a while." "Yes," Sophie said. "It has." She let the silence linger, just long enough for him to squirm. Then she tilted her head, eyes softening. I hope life has been kind to you. John's throat worked. It's been fine. But the word rang hollow. Everyone knew his girlfriend had left months ago, whispers of it spreading through the same circles, now clinking glasses in this hall. The man who once thought himself untouchable now stood exposed, alone at his own celebration. Sophie leaned in slightly, her voice lowering but still clear enough to carry. I wanted to thank you, John, for setting me free, for making room in my life for something better. Confusion flickered across his face, replaced quickly by a grim attempt at indifference. Better. She turned toward Daniel, who met her gaze with quiet pride. Sophie's smile softened into something tender. Yes, much better. Her hand brushed lightly over her stomach, the gesture natural, unforced. Daniel and I are expecting. It's early, but I've never been happier. The color drained from John's face, his glass tipped slightly in his hand, liquid trembling at the rim. Around them, the hum of conversation faltered as those nearby caught the words, eyes widening. Sophie didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply stood radiant, a woman who had been discarded but had bloomed in the soil where she'd been left. John forced a smile that never reached his eyes. Congratulations, he muttered, but the bitterness cracked through. He looked older still, smaller somehow, like the walls of the hall were closing in. Sophie inclined her head. Thank you. Truly. And then she turned away, her arm linked through Daniel's, her laughter mingling with the music as they rejoined the party. Behind them, John stood rooted in place, staring at the life he had so carelessly thrown away. A life now more vibrant and complete than anything he would ever grasp again. In that moment, the scales balanced, not with shouting, not with revenge plotted in shadows, but with dignity, love, and the undeniable glow of a woman who had reclaimed herself. The party faded into memory with the sound of clinking glasses and John's stunned silence, still lingering like a faint echo. By the time Sophie and Daniel returned to the farmhouse, the moon hung high over the Pocono Hills, casting the yard in silver light. Russell trotted ahead of them, tail swaying, eager to be home. Inside, Sophie slipped out of her gown and hung it carefully, then sat by the window in the soft glow of a lamp. She pressed her hands against her stomach, not yet showing but carrying a promise of the future. The farmhouse around her, once abandoned, dark and suffocating, now hummed with life. Flowers she'd arranged filled the kitchen with color. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the repaired clock in the hall marked time in steady rhythms. She thought back to the woman she had been a year ago, the one John had dismissed as boring, the woman who lay on a sagging mattress, staring at boarded windows and believing her life was over. That woman had been buried in grief, discarded like a book with no more chapters. Yet tonight, Sophie felt the truth with a clarity that made her chest ache. She had not been discarded. She had been replanted. Daniel entered the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He set one beside her and sat across, his eyes soft, steady. You okay? He asked. Sophie nodded, her smile faint but sure. Better than okay. I think I finally understand. Understand what? That ending doesn't mean failure, she said, her voice thoughtful. John leaving wasn't the end of me. It was the end of who I was when I let myself disappear. He thought he broke me, but really he set me free. Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, grounding. You set yourself free, Sophie. Don't give him that power. Her eyes shimmered. Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without you, without Russell, without this house reminding me that even ruins can be rebuilt. Russell perked his ears at the mention of his name, patting over to rest his head against her knee. Sophie laughed softly, scratching behind his ears. And him, of course. Their small family, an unexpected constellation of people and a dog, had become something unshakable. Sophie no longer measured her worth in the reflection of John's approval. She measured it in the soil under her fingernails, in the blooms she arranged that carried joy into other people's homes, in the steady love Daniel gave her without condition, and in the quiet life growing inside her. Weeks passed, and Sophie leaned into the rhythm of her new life. Mornings often began with the scent of fresh coffee and Daniel's laughter echoing across the porch. She worked on her floral business, filling orders, attending local markets where her arrangements quickly became favorites. Russell followed her everywhere, occasionally stealing a flower stem and running across the yard, tail high, making her chase him. At night, Sophie and Daniel planned the nursery. They painted the walls soft yellow, set up a crib Daniel had built with his own hands, and hung small mobiles that caught the light. It was a simple space, but to Sophie it felt like a palace. Each brushstroke, each piece of furniture carried the promise of beginnings instead of endings. On quiet evenings, Sophie would walk the property, the air filled with the scent of pine and earth, the sky wide and endless. She thought often of women like her, women who had been told they were too little or too much, who had been pushed aside as if their stories were finished. She wished she could tell them what she now knew, that life after loss wasn't just survival. It was transformation. One golden evening, as summer began to fade, Sophie and Daniel walked hand in hand down the dirt road that curved through the hills. Russell bounded ahead, chasing after crickets in the tall grass. The setting sun draped the world in light, so rich it seemed to bless everything it touched. Sophie paused, taking in the scene, the farmhouse glowing in the distance, the man beside her, the life they had created from brokenness. She turned to Daniel, her voice soft but resolute. "I used to think my story ended the night John left, but it didn't. That was just the prologue. This," she squeezed his hand, eyes shimmering with gratitude. "This is the beginning." Daniel smiled, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "And it's going to be a damn good one." They stood together for a moment, letting the silence wrap around them, the hills echoing with cicadas, the air warm with the last breath of summer. Then, slowly, they began to walk again, the dirt road stretching out before them like an unwritten page. Behind them lay the ruins of an old life. Ahead lay something new, love steady as the river, roots deep as the pines, and hope rising with every step. And as the sun dipped below the Pocono Hills, Sophie Parker knew she had not been abandoned. She had been reborn,